I'm very grateful both for your introduction and for the invitation to take part. I feel a Ukrainian in a way. Allow me also to introduce myself from a different perspective. And I am encouraged to do this from the title of my colleague from Lateranum, Professor Bofi, that mathematics is a bridge to the church more religious science relations. And I have studied mathematics. However, I am not going to deal as my predecessor on natural science and religion and the church, but on a different issue, the anthropological dimension of the church-science relations, which is an issue that will occupy the future of Orthodox theology, but also Christianity and religion in general. It is almost impossible, however, to understand these relations without examining the Christian church's attitude towards modernity. But before doing this, I need to define what orthodoxy, this very precious for us, but at the same time ill-treated, misunderstood, and even badly misused or misinterpreted, as Professor McGrath said, entity really means. Defining orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is normally defined in confessional or denominational terms. In other words, as an Eastern branch of Christianity, which was separated from the West around the beginning of the second millennium. This is at least how the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church describes the Orthodox Church. And I quote, a family of churches situated mainly in Eastern Europe. Each member church is independent in its internal administration, autocephaly in other words, but all share the same faith and are in communion with one another, acknowledging the honorary primacy of the Patriarch of Constantinople, end of quote. This definition no longer holds true. According to its most serious interpreters, Orthodoxy refers to the wholeness of the people of God who share the right conviction, this is the orthodoxa, right opinion, concerning the event of God's salvation in Christ and his church, but at the same time, the right expression of this faith, orthopraxia. Therefore, orthodoxia leads to the maximum possible application in orthopraxia of charismatic life in the freedom of the Holy Spirit in all aspects of daily public life, social and cosmic alike. Everyone, therefore, is invited by orthodoxy to transcend confessions and inflexible institutions without necessarily denying them. The late Professor Nikos Nisiotis, my colleague from the University of Athens, has reminded us that orthodoxy is not to be identified only with us Orthodox in the historical sense and with all our limitations and shortcomings. And I quote, we should never forget that this term was given to the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church as a whole over against the heretics who, of their own choice, split from the main body of the Church. The term, therefore, is exclusive for all those who willingly fall away from this historical stream of the life of the one Church, but it is inclusive for those who profess their spiritual belonging to that stream, end of quote. The term orthodoxy, therefore, has more or less ecclesial rather than confessional or ideological connotations. This ecclesial understanding of orthodoxy has been first put forward by the late George Florovsky, who, speaking at an ecumenical meeting in the name of the one Church, has declared, and I quote, the Church is first of all a worshipping community. Worship comes first, doctrine and discipline second. The lex orandi has a privileged priority in the life of the Christian Church. The lex credendi depends on the devotional experience and vision of the Church. Out of the three main characteristics that generally constitute the essence of the Orthodox theology, namely its Eucharistic, Trinitarian, and hesychastic dimension, only the first one can bear a universal and ecumenical significance. If the last dimension marks hesychasm, a decisive development in Eastern Christian theology and spirituality after the eventual split from the Western Christianity, and if the Trinitarian dimension constitutes the supreme expression of Christian theology ever produced by human thought in its attempt to grasp the mystery of God after Christianity's dynamic encounter with the Greek culture, it was nevertheless only because of the Eucharistic experience, the matrix of all theology, ecclesiology, and spirituality of Christianity, that all theological and spiritual climaxes in the Orthodox Church have been actually developed. The Eucharist is always understood as a proleptic manifestation of the kingdom of God. What is nevertheless of paramount importance is that this kingdom is expected to culminate at the eschaton. Eschatology therefore constitutes the central and primary aspect of ecclesiology. Everything belongs to the kingdom. The church, in her institutional expression, does not administer or reality. She only prepares the way to the kingdom. She is an image of the kingdom. That is why, although to the eyes of the historian and the sociologist, the church is yet another human institution, to the theologian, it is primarily a mystery. And we very often call her an icon of the kingdom to come. Eschatology, however, does not by any means detach the church from the world. We should never forget that theology and the church exist not for themselves, but for the world. The relationship between the ecclesial community and our modern pluralistic society, basically based on science, is one of the most important chapters in the church's witness today. And I will go to the first chapter, which is Orthodoxy, or the church and modernity. I will focus on three areas in an effort to shed light to this issue. First, the church's attitude towards modernity and science, the new understanding of Christian mission, and finally, third, the anthropological dimension of the church-science relations. Science is definitely related to, and for most scholars, is the result of modernity, at least in the modern sense. To properly define the faith-science dichotomy, it is necessary to briefly locate it within the framework of modernity and the dialectics between modernity and postmodernity. Something was hinted by Professor McGrath. In the pre-modern world, the sacred cosmic stories of all religions provided, each for its own culture, of course, the most public and certain knowledge human beings believed they had about reality. After the Enlightenment, in other words, in modernity, the secular science replaced religion as the most certain knowledge that human beings have for the world, whereas the religious stories, values, and views were reduced to matters of personal and private belief and opinion. That is why one of the ideals of modernity was the separation of the church from the state, the relegation of religion to the private realm, and the declaration of the public realm as secular, coming from the Latin term seculum, which is age, in other words, this present world. In other words, free from all religious influence, because the religion, especially the church, focus mainly, as we said, on the world to come. During almost the entire period of modernity, Christianity was reserved, if not hostile, to the principles of modernity. This is more evident in our Eastern Christian world, which has never undergone a full process of modernization. Postmodernity is an ambiguous term used to name an ambiguous time of transition in history. It was discovered in postmodernity that even the scientific knowledge, it was perfectly explained by Professor McGrath, was also an imaginative. This made people aware that their perspective, modern views of the world, could not automatically be assumed to be objective description. All these developments have brought again religion and the church in particular back into the public domain, or at least interest. This made theology adopt a new approach and articulate what is generally called public theology. I firmly believe that the Orthodox cannot exercise, the church cannot exercise her mission in today's pluralistic world in a meaningful and effective way without a reassessment of the present context, without a certain encounter with modernity. If today this encounter is possible and even desirable, this is because of the undisputed tradition of our culture to a new era, the postmodern era, that brought with it, as I said, the resurgence of religion, which, however, can be both a hope and a threat. Peter Berger, a sociologist, half a century ago described the attitude of the church toward the modernist revolution in terms of two opposite positions: accommodation and resistance. In my view, both these positions are inadequate. Resistance is no longer suggested as a practical solution, going against science and so on and so forth, because of the progress made in the theology of mission. I will explain later. As to the accommodation, the impossibility of its application because the church and her theology are incompatible with
Так, будь ласка, Олеже, продовжуйте читати з дозволу спікера.
Отже, професор Василіадіс, що церква як подія спілкування, койнонія вільних людей із 13 главою, 14 стишком і далі. Як це описано в книзі «Об'явлення», також глава 21, 22, як відкрите суспільство, де може відбуватися чесний діалог між церквою і наукою, а також між існуючими живими культурами. Світове плюралістичне суспільство може і повинно стати домогосподарством ойкос, де кожен відкритий для іншого, як відкритий для найвищого, так само, як і відкритий до найвищого і іншого, тобто Бога, і де всі можуть спільно жити та сприятливо формувати загальне благо, зважаючи на їхні пошуки та погляди, а також на множинність та різницю їхньої ідентичності. Всі ці нові події нещодавно були підтверджені священним і Великим собором, який відбувся в Криті 2016 року. Ядро прийнятих документів якого було погоджено та проголосовано усіма 14 автокефальними церквами, включаючи навіть тими, які не брали в ньому участь. Це відповідний для науки абзац у посланні, який узагальнив результати Ради простими словами. І тут цитуємо з цього документу. Що стосується питання відносин християнської віри до природничих наук, Православна церква не прагне брати під свій контроль наукові дослідження і не виносить суджень по кожній науковій проблемі. Церква дякує Богові, який наділив вчених даром відкривати непізнані горизонти божественного творіння. Сучасний розвиток природничих наук і технологій призвело до радикальних змін в нашому житті. Вони приносять значну користь, полегшуючи наше повсякденне життя, допомагаючи виліковувати важкі захворювання.
Excuse me, we will shortly interrupt and go back to translation. We are so happy that Professor Vassiliadis is back. And Oleg, can you help please, Professor, where to start?
Just tell me when, at which point you are now.
It's page number 4.
It's page number 4.
Yes.
Would you like me to tell you where I am, or
Okay.
what would you like to read from the place where you stopped? What would be a better solution?
Let me see.
Which paragraph are you in, Oleg? What was the latest that you...
I just finished quoting the document that was endorsed by all 14 autocephalous churches, paragraph 7.
Okay.
Okay.
So it is page 4, you said?
No, I went even further.
The anthropological dimension of the Orthodox science relation. Is it okay?
Yes, yes.
That would be fine, yes.
Now, the anthropological dimension of the problem of church science, the relation, is the most important ethical issue we Orthodox and all Christians especially face. It is the concept of human identity, the most debated issues of which are in our days the gender theory in general and the nature and role of women in church and society in particular. We all know that in the long history of the undivided church, the era of the ecumenical councils, the theological focus was on Christology, with consequences, of course, to soteriology. In the 20th century, as a result of the division of Christianity and the ensuing ineffectiveness of the Christian mission, the focus inevitably shifted to ecclesiology. The most urgent demand today for the Orthodox theology and the Christian theology in general is undoubtedly of an anthropological character. Metropolitan of Dioclea Callistos insists on the importance of anthropology for the future of Christian theology and witness. Beyond the widely accepted distinction between the apostolic tradition with capital T and all the later local traditions with small t, another important distinction is equally necessary in order to articulate a Christian anthropology, especially an Orthodox anthropology, that of the authentic, though latent, tradition, and the one historically shaped as an ethos, albeit a majority in some cases, this historical tradition is. Metropolitan Callistos argued, and I quote, "Many fathers of the church believe that the divine image in the human being should be related to the power of self-knowledge and of speech. But there are others who may be a minority, but a significant minority, who adopt a more holistic approach, asserting that the divine image includes not only the soul, but the whole being, body, soul, and spirit together. It is in this way they agree with the view expressed by the Fifth Ecumenical Council and with the Christian Creed. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, for example, wrote, "The soul and the spirit can be part of, but not the entire human being. A perfect human being is a union, both of a soul who has the spirit of the Father and held in the image of God, a meaningful flesh, End of quote. According to him, the reality of the human person is beyond and above whatever explanation we choose to give it. Unlike the computer, a human being means to be unpredictable, free and creative, thus inevitably destined to embark on the scientific journey. To give an example, half a century ago, Hélène Cizus and Catherine Clement, in their book celebrated The Newly Born Women, gave the context in which the church is called upon to give her witness on social and moral issues. They spoke about the impossible to predict what will happen with sexual variations in the future in 200 or 300 years. Men and women are involved in a web of centuries of cultural determinations that are almost impossible to analyze in their complexity. It is now impossible to talk about women or men as we know them till now. After the Second World War, the new ethical issues have arisen, forcing the Christian world, and especially their theology, mostly in an apologetic tone, ignoring most of the time the newest findings of science. Today, there is a clear distinction between what is a sin, a theological or a Christian term, and what is a crime, a secular. Adultery, for instance, is always a sin, but in most countries, it is not an offense punishable by the law. Rape, on the other hand, continues to be both a sin and a crime. In some, whereas previously the human identity was considered as something given, today it is also argued, not by all, but by a majority of scholars, that all identities are constructions formed by their environment, thus developing a new ethos. Modernity attempts to impose this kind of inclusive ethos with all kinds of understandings, while traditional societies, especially religious ones, advocate an exclusive given ethos. Now, science and Christian and Orthodox anthropology. To address this new situation, Christians and Orthodox especially appear unprepared. The following three considerations therefore seem necessary. First, a theological reconsideration of human sexuality. Second, a new dynamic and scientific interpretation of the biblical and patristic text with a new and better interpretation. And third, a prudent approach to scholarly and scientific results, especially with regard to the nature and role of women in church and society. In the ecumenical world, a letter from Sheffield was sent to all churches saying, starting the decade, Churches in Solidarity with Women, we welcome the recognition that human sexuality does not contradict the Christian spirituality, which is identified and concerns the body, the mind, and the spirit in their entirety. Unfortunately, sexuality itself has been for centuries and continues to be problematic. End of quote. In the Bible, of course, human beings are not determined by their nature, but by their relationship with God and with their fellow human beings. Therefore, their salvation is not achieved through any denial of the body, including sexuality. Moreover, the disobedience of our ancestors did not bequeath guilt to humankind and even linked to sexuality, but it was linked to morality and perishability. The physical and spiritual function of the human beings are perceived as an inseparable unity, and both can either distance them from God or put them at his service. That is, in communion with him. The flesh is not identified with evil, nor is it extremely dangerous. It becomes so when humans exclusively base their existence on it. Unbridled and heterosexual and unnatural, not only homosexual, but also heterosexual sexual activity on the one hand, but also hypocrisy on the other are, at least for St. Paul, in dealing with this issue in the first two chapters in the book of Romans, examples are of wrong human behavior. Equally, in the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, as a great Orthodox scholar, the late Father John Meyendorff has long ago argued, and I quote, human nature is not a static, closed, autonomous entity, but a dynamic reality. The human being is a relationship with God, end of quote. Fall, because by the grace of God, it can be transformed and become again integral. Indeed, the role of God's grace is that it essentially provides human beings with their natural substance, hypostasis. The subject of human sexuality, therefore, is directly related to Christian anthropology. And the main area of controversy is the gender issue, with homosexuality and the role of women in church and society being the main anthropological components. I will not deal with homosexuality because we lost some time. With regard to women in the wider Christian circles, until very recently, those who supported the rights of women and her dignity as human persons created by God primarily relied on the famous Galatian passage, there is no longer male and female. At the other end, the various supporters, mainly from the conservative evangelical world, of the literal reading of the biblical texts without qualitative grading, limited the value of the above passage only to its narrow salvific dimension, that women can be saved as men. Therefore, they adopt other passages of the Corpus Paulinum, scholarly considered as Deutero-Pauline, as identifying the authentic Pauline view. However, neither the Galatian passage nor those of exactly the opposite view are now considered as the Pauline contribution to the nature of women's role in society from the earliest Christian tradition, which St. Paul simply adopted as he did for the Eucharist and the Christ resurrection, because they simply stem from the later Deutero-Pauline or post-Pauline literature, not representing the authentic teaching of the historical Paul. I use this term also because we know the discussion about the historical Jesus of history. All verses except the one demanding women to be silenced in the church, according to the 1 Corinthians 14th chapter. This passage, however, in addition to being contrary to the argument of St. Paul himself in the same epistle 3 chapters earlier, according to which women are not only allowed to have a praying, a liturgical, but also a teaching presence in the liturgical synaxes of Corinth, these verses also break the flow of the argument and its literary coherence after verse 36. It is also missing or replaced in some early manuscripts. All this led biblical scholarship and science, as well as modern interpreters, to conclude that this passage is a later addition, a gloss in other ways, a term used in biblical scholarship, in the original text of the epistle. However, what radically changed the state of scholarship and the biblical research was the discovery of the significance of the last chapter of the Epistle to the Romans, an epistle the most expensive in the New Testament, in which we find the fullest exposition of the Pauline Gospel. In Romans 16, the first two chapters, Paul recommends to the Romans a woman called Phoebe from the harbor of city of Corinth, Kechrae, with the addition that she is a leading figure. She was called deacon, and although at that time the deacons were not an official liturgical institution, Phoebe must have been a prominent and leading person in the Corinthian church. Moreover, the fact that Paul recommends to the recipients a woman who carries this letter probably suggests that Phoebe certainly was on a very significant mission. A little further down, Paul greets a woman and her husband, Prisca and Aquila. The important thing in this case is that the woman is mentioned prior to her husband, in contrast to the ancient practice, which may mean that Prisca was the leader of her own church at home. According to the book of Acts, the couple was expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius and met with Paul in Corinth. There, we also read that Prisca and her husband have taught Apollos the correct faith. In any case, Paul calls them co-workers, synergos, a title that is in his original letters is given to important leaders of the church like Apollos, Titus, and Timothy. In verse 6, there is a reference to Mariam, identified by some commentators with Mary Magdalene. Of extreme importance is the verb kopian, struggling, used here and repeated twice later in this chapter also for other three women, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and further down, Persis. All these references indicate certainly that the female participation in the leadership, management, and ministry of the early church. But the most important reference appears in verse 7 of the 16th chapter, which refers to a woman apostle, Junia. There, Paul greets two people who were prominent, as he said, among the apostles. One was Andronicus, a male name, but the other, which also is an apostle, and even before Paul, in most of the older Western translations was attributed to a man, although Junia was quite a common female name in Roman use, never a male one. If Junia is a female, is a woman, and Junia is the right name, and in the Orthodox tradition it has always been as such, and in addition she was from the beginning venerated as a saint, and especially twice, in February 22 and in May 17. And lastly, this reading has become widely accepted in all official scientific translations. Then we have a further proof that women were apostles at an early stage in the early Christian tradition. And allow me to give you a testimony from the 6th century after Christ, from Saint Gregory, the Patriarch of Antioch, who, in praising the mere-bearing women, wrote, and I quote, "Tell my disciples," it's Jesus speaking, the resurrected Christ is speaking, "tell my disciples what mysteries you have seen. Become teachers of the teachers. Let Peter, the one who denied me, that I can," and listen to the verb, to the terms, "I can ordain also female apostles." To conclude, there is no doubt that St. Paul's view on the nature and role of women has faithfully followed the teaching and general behavior of the historical Jesus. In addition to what was described above, many other issues pertinent to Christian anthropology are being recently discussed, especially the imperative need for the admission of women into the diaconal sacramental priesthood, in other words, as liturgically ordained deaconesses. And in addition, an ecological approach can hardly be ignored. The male and female, note, not male or female, the male-female interrelatedness is also mutually related to a Christian understanding of integral ecology. There is an interesting concern in all the traditional ancient churches, the Orthodox included, especially the Catholic, where an ambivalent admixture of natural law and patriarchal ideology is evident. If man and woman complete each other in both church and society, why is patriarchal male headship still enshrined in our church's ministry, given that men and women are fully homogeneous in their whole beings? This obviously stems from a patriarchal ideology of male domination and female submission, which for many scholars was the consequence of the Augustinian doctrine of the original sin. As long as the patriarchal binary prevails in human relations, as well as in human nature relations, there can be no fully integral ecology. As long as human behaves as the dominant male and treats nature as a submissive female, there can be no lasting social justice, which will result in the destruction of our environment. It is true that the Old Testament exemplifies patriarchal bias in many ways, notably by the metaphor of the woman coming out of man from the first chapter in Genesis. It is inescapable, however, that this was corrected in the New Testament, notably by the Pauline explicit statement that when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman. God becoming incarnate from a woman is a reversal of a woman coming out of man. For the Church, the rehabilitation of women to status of equality at all levels is an acute ethical issue. For extreme cases, women were never entrusted leading roles in ritual, even though in the Orthodox Church the order of deaconesses was an accepted and celebrated liturgical office. The gender ambivalence of ritual is revealed by the dichotomy between theology and practice. While the Orthodox liturgy and all Christian liturgy includes female saint veneration and reputes the Theotokos, and I quote, as more honorable than the cherubim and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, in other words, above the world of the celestial beings, down on earth women are excluded from joining the superior clergy, even to the rank of deaconesses, which is discussed in modern Orthodox biblical scholarship and general theological scholarship. The issue at stake is not the ordination of women as such, in other words, as a sociological issue of a power struggle, and some would say a demand of modernity and the scientific revolution, but the missiological, liturgical, anthropological, and ecological dimension of the diaconal understanding of the Christian priesthood. And I conclude with a few words. Orthodoxy and or the Church Universal, in order to effectively witness to the gospel in today's modern and postmodern context, in addition to reaffirming her ecclesial and not confessional or ideological identity and her authentic perception of eschatology, she desperately needs a new encounter with modernity and a new and dynamic relations with science, as presented in the previous paper, especially in periods of pandemic, and a coherent anthropology quite evident in the authentic, though latent, Orthodox tradition in dealing with today's burning ethical issues such as the gender theory and the nature of women and her role in church and society. I do apologize for this interruption, of course. Back to you, Roman.
Thank you very much, Professor Vassiliadis. It's a really very dense and an informative talk that gives an exposition of Orthodox approach, or with the focus on anthropology, to the array of questions that you discussed in your paper. In a way, we have a very complemented now view, Western and Eastern, on the problematic of science and religion. I have selected two questions for you from our audience. Professor Vassiliadis, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Yes, again, thank you very much for your highly informative talk. And now we have a session of questions and answers. And I have selected two questions for you, and if you can comment on that. The first question is, how would you briefly describe similarities and differences in dealing with the problematic of science and religion from the Orthodox perspective in comparison to typical Western Catholic or Protestant approaches? Can you comment on this? I'll just briefly translate the question for the Ukrainian audience, and you have a minute to think about. Отже, питання, які є схожі і відмінні аспекти, коли йдеться про проблематику співвідношення науки і релігії з православної перспективи до типових західних підходів, чи католицьких, чи протестантських. Professor Vassiliadis, please.
I think the question is very important, and I will continue what Professor McGrath said earlier, and I will explain why I concentrated on the anthropological dimension. Last century, the world in the West especially was occupied by the so-called evolution theory, or about the famous, at the beginning of last century, the famous trial of apes. In the Eastern Christian world, this kind of opposition between the natural science and Christian faith was not so much influential, because, as Professor McGrath said, there were many important writers, especially Saint Basil the Great, who in his explanation of the first 6 days of the Genesis he was so open to the scientific approach as, of course, St. Augustine was in the Latin tradition, the Latin Christian tradition. So this is the problem with regard to the natural science. There is a more acute problem in the West with regard to natural science faith relations, whereas in the Eastern tradition, in our Orthodox tradition, because we have not undergone, as I said, the so-called modern process, the so-called secularization, but not in the bad sense, but in the proper sense, the theology and the church are unprepared with regard to the new developments in medicine, in biology, in genetics, and also in areas like the so-called moral issues. It is not accidental that whereas the Western reaction against the so-called new tendencies, moral tendencies, were concentrated on the so-called moral issues, pro-life movements and so on and so forth. In our church, in our Eastern tradition, especially with the initiative of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, more emphasis was given on the so-called social issues, especially the environmental issue. That's why it was considered, and also the recent Pope has followed this with the Laudato Si on the same direction. This is my view. There is no differences, but there are some more emphasis because of the so-called traditional values of its Western and Eastern Christianity. This is in brief.
Yeah, thank you. I will translate this for the Ukrainians. Отже, відповідь професора Василіадіса. Останнє століття, 20 століття, в західному контексті внесло велике замішання через обговорення процесів наукових відкриттів, пов'язаний з еволюцією, з еволюціонізмом. І чому я на тому тлі вибрав антропологічний фокус своєї доповіді? Тому що на Сході історично склалось так, що не було такої напруги між християнським світоглядом, між християнством і природничими науками. Вони якось автономно існували, і не було такої опозиції. В додаток до того, патристична традиція, зокрема такими особами, як Василій Великий чи Григорій Богослов, вона була відкрита до еволюціоністської інтерпретації 6 днів сотворіння чи походження Всесвіту. Так само, як згадав професор Макграф про те, що Августин і інтерпретації його відкриті до нової інтерпретації, до еволюціоністської інтерпретації походження Всесвіту. На Заході ця проблематика постала дуже гостро, бо вона була в контексті модернізму і постмодернізму. А Схід, в свою чергу, не досвідчив таких інтенсивних процесів в період модерну, як це було на Заході. Тому ця проблематика залишилася частково осторонь. Крім того, зараз дуже видно, що церква не готова православна церква не готова до багатьох цих питань, зокрема, коли йдеться про біологію, генетику і багато інших сфер природничих наук. Також викликами є моральні питання, про які я згадував в доповіді, і це рух за життя і так далі. Тому Православна Церква сфокусувалася в більшості на питаннях, які спільні і для Заходу, зокрема, питання довкілля і питання екологічної свідомості. Так, патріарх Варфоломій зробив ці кроки, і вслід йому Папа Франциск також видав енцикліку Laudato Si, і, власне, ця сфера екології і довкілля є тим, що є спільного зараз між Заходом і Сходом у цій царині. I have another question for you, Professor Vassiliadis, and it goes like this. In the light of the Pauline letters that you discussed in your talk, and in particular the stories of the prominent women leaders, how do you see personally the women's role in the Orthodox Church nowadays? Отже, питання у світлі листів Павла і, власне, історії про видатних жінок-лідерок апостольського періоду. Як професор Василіадіс бачив би роль жінок в сучасній православній церкві? Professor Vassiliadis, please.
I am now presenting the so-called results of modern biblical scholarship, but not only biblical scholarship. The biblical scholarship with regard to women's role in the early church, based mainly on the gospel narratives that exemplify an important role at the very high moment of the Son of God's earthly life, his passion and resurrection. And the evidence we have, as I said, from the Pauline epistles, show that this was not something that was a peripheral issue. And in addition, modern archaeological findings have accompanied the so-called evidence we have, the liturgical text we have from the 8th century, Codex Barbarini and so on, including the role of the deaconess and the ordination in accordance with the higher priesthood, of course, with the difference between the priestly function of the presbyter and the bishop and the diaconal one. We have now findings from the early period, the first 4 centuries, with some artifacts that have shown not only in catacombs, previously only in catacombs we had, but we have also a sarcophag from the second Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, before the erection by Justinian, the new big one, a sarcophag where we have women together with men in a praying position, in a orange position, as we call it in the archaeology. And these are not only isolated findings. There are plenty even in the crypt of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. Was found another discovery from ivory containing the holy relics, in which women also praise on the holy table, raising the cup. And with these findings, we are now able to explain the Saint Vitellius mosaic in Ravenna, 15th or 16th century, where on the one side we have Justinian holding with priests and the local bishop Maximianos holding the paten with the holy bread, and Theodora holding the holy chalice on exactly the same position, which means that even after the so-called I don't want to mention also that Saint Nona, the mother of Saint Gregory, died on the around the holy table, and we know this from Saint Gregory's final speech about her. So we have many not only biblical but also later discoveries and findings that give, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Christian world, this kind of women presence, at least in the diaconal. As I said, we're not talking about ordination of women, which is a power struggle, which is promoted by so-called the feminists, but for a diaconal dimension of the Christian faith.
Yeah, thank you. I will resume your answer for the Ukrainians. Отже, я, відповідаючи на це запитання, хочу взяти до уваги кілька аспектів, зокрема, не лише результати біблійних досліджень, про які я згадував, але також і цілий комплекс, зокрема, біблійні розповіді про страсті і воскресіння, і те все, що я згадував в корпусі святого Павла. Все це доводить мене на думку, що питання жіночого служіння в церкві – це далеко не периферійне питання, не другорядне питання, тому що окрім цих біблійних свідчень, ми на сьогодні маємо великий корпус артефактів, які походять з археології, зокрема Кодекс Барберіні, які нам розкривають роль дияконес і роль свячень жіночих в контексті ранньої церкви. Перші 4 століття свідчать про те, що жінки мали визначну роль у літургійному служінні. І на сьогодні це не лише катакомби, бо недавно ці артефакти походили з катакомб. На сьогодні ми маємо дуже цікаве свідчення з періоду другого періоду святого базиліки чи катедри Святої Софії у Царгороді, зокрема саркофаг з цього другого періоду, де ми бачимо, що і жінки, і чоловіки є в позиції літургійного моління. Також важливим свідченням є знахідка у крипті святого Петра у Римі. Був віднайдений релікварій зі слонової кістки, який також демонструє літургійну роль жінок. Всі ці археологічні і біблійні свідчення разом дають нам можливість інтерпретувати дуже загадкову, але потужну мозаїку собору у Равенні, яка походить з 15 століття і зображає Теодору, яка тримає чашу на рівні і поруч з єпископом. Тому на сьогодні ми можемо говорити, що є численні свідчення біблійні, позабіблійні, археологічні, які дають нам підстави говорити про те, що жінки мали суттєву літургійну роль у ранньому християнстві. Інше питання, що сучасний феміністичний рух, який обрамлений боротьбою за владу, power struggle, це якби інша траєкторія, але коли ми розглядаємо контекст християнського свідчення, то маємо беззаперечні свідчення того, що жінки мали визначну роль у літургійному житті в ранньому християнстві.
May I add something also from the Russian and Kievan tradition?
Чи можу я додати щось до цього з перспективи слов'янської, російської і київської, української традиції?
Russian and Kievan sisterhoods and brotherhoods have developed before the so-called Soviet Revolution, and the church herself devoted in the Great Sobor in 1917 to 18 great progress towards reviving the order of deaconesses. Unfortunately, it was the revolution that has stopped this process. So we try, I mean, in addition to Theodoru, also from your tradition. And also, my paper can be shared to all participants, please. The full text.
Yes. Київська традиція дореволюційна також має численні свідчення про служіння дияконес. І собор 1917-18 року Православної церкви зробив великий прогрес у напрямку відновлення служіння дияконес, але був перерваний, очевидно, подіями більшовицької революції. Тому і те, що ми маємо в Равенні з Теодорою, і те, що ми маємо в контексті Київської церкви, воно суголосне. Це я хотів додати у відповідь на своє запитання. Thank you very much, Professor Vassiliadis. I think we are slightly running out of time. I would like to thank you again for your wonderful and highly informative talk. And I would like to ask Roman Solovey to say a few housekeeping remarks for the sessions that will follow this plenary session with the main speakers. Please.